The RZIM Academy was born out of Ravi's vision for creating an online training program. At the time, we were offering great in-person training in places like the OCCA in Oxford, England, or summer programs in specific cities in the US, Canada, and India. But what about those who can't get to those places? Then we started the Academy. I'm not sure we realized how much interest there would be, but we're celebrating 5 years since we launched our first course, and the response has been overwhelming.
From the first lecture in the core module, I was all in because I knew it was exactly what I needed to strengthen my personal relationship with Christ, to ground me in my faith so that I was able to not only demonstrate what it means to be a Christian, but also defend it.
Just the wealth of the information presented and the way in which it was conducted, the heart behind the program really made an impact in my life.
Was ich persönlich besonders gut an der Zacharias Akademie finde, ist, dass sie mich dafür sensibilisiert, meinen Gesprächspartner ernst zu nehmen und ihn wertzuschätzen. Es geht in Gesprächen ja nicht nur darum, auf Fragen zu antworten, sondern einer Person zu begegnen, die hinter der Frage steht.
At first I thought this is an academic challenge for me, but to my surprise it was something that really changed and transformed the way I view evangelism, the way I view Christianity.
We've now enrolled more than 10,000 students from more than 130 different countries. We have courses in 4 languages. We have a growing list of elective courses on topics like Islam, suffering, the Bible, science, what it means to be human, with more being produced each year.
I think a lot of people will find it helpful. A lot of people will find it that it may push them to reach out to others. You'll probably reach people you never imagined you can reach before or even talk to. And I feel it's the skills and that confidence that we know not only what to say and how to say it and how to relate to others with the gospel.
The feedback and stories we hear from students has been tremendous, and we're really encouraged to continue to build this program and watching how God uses it all over the globe.
This is the task of Christian apologetics, whether it be in debate, whether it be in argument, whether it be in defense, whether it be in confirmation. It is ultimately to present the person of Jesus Christ and who he is. Set apart that Christ in your heart and always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you, and do that with gentleness and respect.
Welcome to Y Series 2019. We are broadcasting live from London. We're examining together some of the most important questions in contemporary debate from a Christian perspective. For the first hour, we'll be joined first by Andy Moore, who's going to be looking at the issue of gene manipulation. After a Q&A with Andy, we'll be joined by Dr. Callum Miller, who is a Christian ethicist and a qualified medical doctor, who'll be tackling the issue of euthanasia and bringing his professional and thoughtful insights to that question. I'd like to encourage you to open your notebooks and enjoy the company of Andy and then Callum as we confront together two of the most important and significant questions within ethics today.
Well, that's the online academy. If you want to have a look at it, do go online. You can see about it there. And it never ceases to amaze me the number of people I meet around the world as I get to travel who've been on that program and loved it and been enriched by it so much. For those of you joining us on the live stream, welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world and whatever time zone you're in. We hope that you're going to find the following helpful. Well, it's a real privilege for me to welcome Andy Moore up here. He is the director of Festival of Thought, our business outreach. He's been a colleague for several years now. He's working on his English accent, as you'll soon discover. It's yet to be perfected. But Andy, it's wonderful to have you here, and please lead us into the next session.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Hey, everybody. Really good to see you and to be with you this afternoon. I hope you're enjoying this chance today to look into some of the huge questions of our time and of our culture. And it would appear that it does now fall to me to share some thoughts on just the tiny little issue of the future of the entire human race, which I'm sure is all in a day's work for you, as it is for me, and we're all very glad that we had our Weetabix this morning. Now, I saw the Avengers Endgame film last week, and I did want to come today dressed as Spider-Man. But I was told in no uncertain terms by marketing and HR that this was not the impression of the ministry that we wanted you to take away. So I can't dress up as Spider-Man, but I can ask you, who else has been quite excited by the Avengers film recently? Put your hand up if you've seen it. A few people? Yeah, okay, maybe about 50% of the room. What's remarkable about this film is not just that it's on the way to becoming the highest grossing film of all time, but that it's doing so at a record pace. Now, if you've never heard of the Avengers Endgame film, let me just confirm to you what I think you already know, that you are culturally irrelevant. The Avengers are this group of superheroes that come together to rescue the universe from different forms of catastrophe from time to time. And in this Endgame film, they come together to settle a score with one of their oldest, most scary, most vile enemies from across the whole time that they've been defending the universe. And you've got Iron Man. Iron Man is actually just the human Tony Stark, wearing a really cool suit, which lets him do cool things, including flying. You've got the Incredible Hulk. This is actually Dr. Bruce Banner, who in his human life is quite weak and a retiring kind of character, but when the Hulk comes upon him, he is able to summon superhuman strength and do amazingly powerful things that he could only dream of in the status of being Dr. Bruce Banner. You've got Black Panther. He leads the world in terms of scientific knowledge and his development of high-tech gear and different things, different forms of technology that the rest of us can only dream of. So the Avengers have all got their individual strengths and different things they can do, but what they all have in common is the fact that they are, on the one hand, humans with very kind of ordinary lives, and the film gives us a little bit of an insight into some of their ordinary lives and their characteristics. They are, on one level, human, but they are, on another level, humanoids, integrated with various forms of technology, which help them transcend their normal weaknesses, their normal limitations, so that they become these kind of next-level beings, upon whom the future of the whole universe depends. Now, we're all waiting to see whether Avengers will overtake Avatar, which is the second highest grossing film of all time. I haven't seen the data today. Maybe it has actually overtaken. Let's wait and see what the next week brings. But Avatar, I'm sure many of you have seen as well. This was the 2009 epic directed by James Cameron, set a few hundred years in the future, when humans are now using these genetically engineered so-called Navi bodies to live on a distant planet called Pandora. And the reason that humans are interested in Pandora is because Pandora has got lots and lots of a particular semiconductor called unobtainium. And the humans need to get their hands on this unobtainium so that the rate of technological development back on Earth can be protected. And with that, the future of the human race. Now, I wonder what you would say is the reason for the amazing popularity of these kinds of films in our culture. What would you say to that question? One answer that I would offer, one reason that these films strike such a chord, is because they tap into and reflect back to us an idea which many of us are either explicitly or implicitly committed to. An idea that the future of the human race rests with technology. That we must super-engineer ourselves in different kinds of ways, maybe on the one hand to eradicate disease, on the other hand to enhance our strengths, our abilities, the things that give us power in life. We have to do this in order to somehow raise the status of our being. Perhaps one day, even, to make ourselves immortal. The perennial quest of the human race. It's no coincidence that the arch enemy in the Avengers film is called Thanos. Greek nerds in the room, you will know this sounds like Thanatos, which in Greek means death. The Avengers set out to defeat death. And the film hinges on the moment where Thanos says, "I am inevitable." And then Iron Man says, "No, because I am Iron Man." And then some kind of laser comes out, and that's enough to settle it. Death versus mankind, the perennial quest of humanity, at the heart of the two highest grossing films in all history. And in both cases, the solution is linked to technology. Our culture is obsessed with the idea that hope for the human race is contained in technology. And this is an idea which is starting to be based much more on science than on fiction. One technological area which is becoming particularly advanced, and which I'm going to focus on for the time we have today, is the area of genetic enhancement. We've seen the success of the Human Genome Project, and billions of dollars invested, and lots of discoveries coming out of that pioneering piece of scientific research. We've seen the success of that, and we've had technology such as CRISPR developed, an acronym for 6 words I'm not going to try and pronounce from the stage, but you can read it. Scientists have realized that many of our genetic illnesses, weaknesses, limitations, many of these genetic frailties can be eradicated from the human future if we have the desire to eradicate them. And we would do that through various germline interventions. In 2017, the BBC reported that scientists have, for the first time, successfully freed embryos of a piece of faulty DNA that causes heart disease to run in families. So 10,000 different kinds of disorders have now been eradicated from that particular germline. Those disorders will no longer be passed on to future generations. We can cut out pieces of the human genome that we don't want, genes that might cause disease, and then we can paste back in genes that we do want, genes that might enhance some of our strengths and our abilities, enhancements to our memories, our intelligence, our physical performance, or maybe even just to follow a particular preference that we might have in the area of eye color, for example. We're living in a really unique time. A really unique time where the decisions taken by generations now living could, and probably will, have direct, possibly irreversible impacts on future generations. The advancement of modern science is presenting immensely challenging issues. And it's calling into question some of our most basic assumptions about what we thought human life was and about the nature of our existences. And the force of the argument is felt in our culture because we have for several decades behaved in such a way as that when the possibility of doing something arises, it becomes the moral obligation to do something. If something can be done, something must be done. Now that we know it is possible to eradicate genetic conditions from the human future, genetic conditions like Down syndrome, like cystic fibrosis, conditions which some of us in the room may well be living with, or people that we love and know in our family live with. These conditions, we are told that because it is possible to eradicate them from the future, we absolutely should. We have a moral obligation to do so. Or at the same time, now that we know how to make ourselves more intelligent or have better performance or better memories or be able to do lots of things that we can only dream of right now, then we should absolutely enhance ourselves to be able to do those things as well. It just makes no sense to willingly accept limitation. Nick Bostrom, who is the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford, says our bodies are death traps, which we should absolutely strive to escape from. Another key voice is the philosopher Julian Savulescu. And Savulescu says that we simply must enhance ourselves because to willingly accept limitation when something could have been done is just the other side of the coin of deliberately inflicting disability on ourselves or on our children. He says that we have significant moral reason to select the best children through the screening of embryos or children in the womb, and we should discard or abort as required. This is powerful language. These are emotive debates. And we're not far removed from questions of who or what we really are and of what our responsibility for the future really is. Are we avengers who with technology must one day defeat death and all kinds of threats and illness along the way? Or are we as humans barging our way into a conversation which is just a little bit above our pay grade? For Christians, this feels like a very difficult one. We perceive something of an inherent attraction to the idea. We do want to see less pain and suffering in the world. We do want our children to have the best lives possible. Perhaps God has endowed us with these abilities and given us this knowledge for precisely these reasons. But still, something doesn't feel quite right. Let me say clearly that we're not primarily talking about the cure of disease in the future or better care for people suffering in the future. We are talking about the prevention of people coming to birth with forms of genetic disease. That is a very different vision. That seems to be something more destructive than creative. That seems to be less in line with human flourishing than with denying what is real and true about ourselves, that we are vulnerable creatures. And what I want to do here is just try and paint the big picture for us. See if I can pick out some of the themes operating at a high level in this big debate. And from that vantage point, see if we can discern some things which might be the beginnings of our opinions on the matter, and which might be the beginnings of seeing the incredible difference that the gospel makes. And I do this primarily as a philosopher, someone who has reflected at length on the worldview issues at stake, not as a biologist. I'm not a biologist, but I do my best to keep up with what the biologists are saying. So 3 points to touch on quickly. 3 worldview issues at stake and choices which must be made. Firstly, in our view of the future. Secondly, in our view of humanity's problem. And thirdly, our view of what exactly happened at the cross. So firstly, in our view of the future, and a choice to be made between placing faith in human possibility or placing faith in the promises of God. I don't know how much time you've spent thinking about the future in a serious way, about the hope you might feel about the future, or the basis of that hope. Not just in terms of being home tonight in time for Britain's Got Talent, or to look forward to a nice Sunday lunch tomorrow, but the hope that you have in your view of what the future will contain fundamentally. What does the future contain fundamentally? What is the direction of travel of not just your life, but of the whole cosmos, of everything and everyone that you see around you? What's it all for? Where is it all going? The theologian N.T. Wright says that what we think about the future is a matter of thinking straight about God and his purposes for the cosmos, and about what God is doing right now, already, as part of those purposes. It's the key to thinking seriously about everything else. Indeed, it is one of the main reasons for thinking seriously about anything at all. The idea of a future in the hands of human possibility and progress is deeply rooted in our culture, and it does underpin many of the arguments in favor of genetic enhancement. Cut and paste humans as we try to make ourselves better. The idea that we are all kind of responsible agents in this great cosmic project that can and will continue to develop towards perfection and maybe immortality. Perhaps a utopia of our own making. In the words of John Wyatt, we now see politics as a way of making a better world and fashioning stronger communities. Psychologists advise us how to build stronger relationships. Business entrepreneurs create wealth. Oliver O'Donovan, every activity is understood as making. Every situation in which we act is just raw material, waiting for us to make something of it. To entrust our future, to put our faith in human possibility, means to refer our ethical questions to what mankind can do. And it is to restrict our ethics only by reference to what mankind wants. But if we were to refer our ethical questions not to the question of what mankind can do, but to the question of what mankind is for, we would have an opposite idea of the future. a future coming from the other direction, not driven by what mankind can fashion out of its lot, but by what the immanent God has done, is doing, and will do. This would be hope not in what mankind discovers to be possible, but in what mankind discovers to be true of the promises of God, of his character, and of his action in history. A future not of mankind's utopia, but of God's kingdom. A kingdom where it is promised that there will be no more sickness, illness, death, or pain. That is the direction of travel in the universe. But the point of entry is not with our own making. It's through relationship with the God whose kingdom it is. Jesus says, I promised you this. This is going to happen. But we don't need Kingdom 2.0. Instead, you concentrate on entering my kingdom and bringing as many people and extending to them an invitation to be part of it as well. Your view of the future and the balance of the hope that you feel between mankind's progress and God's promises will, to a large extent, inform the urgency you feel about the need for genetic enhancement, which is connected with the second worldview issue, our view of whether humanity's deepest problem is material or moral. Is it a problem with our bodies or with our hearts? Because that goes such a long way to informing the type of solution we think we need. Luke chapter 5 is very instructive here. Remember when some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat, and they tried to put him in front of Jesus. They ended up having to put him through the roof to get him there, and they lowered them right in front of Jesus' nose, in the middle of the crowd, in everyone's hearing. Jesus said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." What? It was as startling to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law now as it is to us, or teachers of the law then, as it is to us now, to hear that Tony Stark, the problem is not with your suit, it's with your heart. No matter how far human progress may take us, it is powerless to address our biggest problem: sin and estrangement from the God who created us, who knows us, who loves us. Relationship with him is the source of flourishing in this life and the next. Scientific progress cannot stop human evil. It can't do anything about human evil in the past. Hope is not found in mankind becoming God, but in the God who became man. He has seen our pain, he's seen our sorrow, and he's given us hope for the future. So thirdly and finally, this will hinge on what you think happened at the cross. Is it tragedy? Nothing more hopeless in all the universe. A man who lived a better life than any of us ever could, a better moral life, but still vanquished by physical death and failure of the material body like the rest of us. A man who claimed to be the Son of God, on a mission, he said, to set humanity free from disease and illness, not primarily, although he did bring healing to everyone he met as he went along, to set us free from sin and the consequences of estrangement from God at the heart of our problem. Was his death on the cross a tragedy? Or was it triumph? Because, ladies and gentlemen, what happened next is the surest foundation for all our hope in the future. There in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain. Then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. For I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. The return of this risen, glorious, resurrected Christ is our hope, our security, for the future. He's addressed our biggest problem through his death. And in his resurrection, he has secured for us the possibility of fulfillment, health, joy, life everlasting. So before you guys ask me lots of very difficult questions, let me finish by asking you one. Who's your money on? Tony Stark or Jesus? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. We've got a couple of minutes, about 5 or maybe just under, to ask Andy a couple of questions. And so if you haven't already, you'll see if you go to the Pigeonhole app, which we suggested you download to your phone, you'll see you can post questions there and also vote for questions which have been posted already. So let me just start with the first one here. It says, is there a line between trying to prolong human life and accepting God's will, sovereignty? I'm asking that question because I'm wondering what to do with Tom Price. And so I'm just wondering that whole thing about prolonging and just accepting that will for his life.
Yeah. Let me just retrospectively apologize for the nasal quality in my voice today. I've been nursing a little bit of a cold. But this is a great question, and I'm very glad, therefore, that Callum is going to be speaking afterwards, because it ties in to some of these issues around the end of life and how we best care for each other when those times come. And I do think there is a line between trying to prolong human life, can I use the word artificially, using various forms of machinery, which would be the reason that a person continues to breathe or continues to have different things which keep their body alive, which naturally, removing that machinery would not allow them to continue to live. It's questions of palliative care and what we do around those times when people are on their last days. I do think there is a line here. It is technically possible to keep people exhibiting various forms of life artificially when, as the words in the question kind of insinuate that God's will, the natural course of things would be for their body to reach a natural end. That is a question of mercy, a question of judgment, a question of palliative care, and which I know that Calum will touch upon. But notice clearly what I'm not saying. We're not inducing death. It's not assisted dying. It's accepting a natural line between those two things.
Okay. Right, so the next question, as on the current voting we have here, is what do we learn from the fact that Jesus didn't physically heal every sick person around him during his ministry?
There are a number of occasions where we get an insight into what's going on when in the Gospels we read a report of a healing ministry by Jesus. John chapter 9 comes to my mind particularly, where there are two things that Jesus seeks to clarify. Firstly, about why the person before him is ill. They ask about this man, is he ill because because this is a punishment of his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus says very clearly, no, he's not ill for that particular reason. He says that what's about to happen declares something of the glories of God. When that story continues on, and Jesus does produce the healing, there are all sorts of questions around afterwards. And we're struggling to work out exactly why Jesus decides to heal some and not others at the time, but with that common denominator of the glories of God being relevant to how we understand what's happening. And the point that I made about the paralytic who was brought in front of Jesus, and that startling thing that he said, and that, friend, your sins are forgiven, actually brings us round to what Jesus wants us all to understand in terms of our most fundamental human problem, the thing which we need to take care of and which in the long run is more of a problem for us than physical pain, is our relationship with God, and how perhaps also in the dialogue between Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, we see these things which the people around in the context of healing were struggling to put into place. You're supposed to be good, you're supposed to heal everyone you see across, but you're not doing it. You're not doing it in line with our expectations. And Jesus is trying to lift their eyes to look slightly, to see beyond to the bigger picture and to the hope of his resurrected body and his resurrected return. Just some thoughts towards that one.
Okay. Now, we have a question here about abortion and medical reasons, and Dr. Callum Miller actually has a specialism in this area he'll be sharing next. So what I'm going to suggest is when we go on to the final panel on which he will be on, we put that question to him, and we may also be able to give you a link if you want to see him answering that question on was it a BBC TV program? Was it, I can't remember which was one of the main broadcasters in the UK where he appeared on a live show answering some questions, I think, about some of those kinds of life and death issues from a Christian perspective. So why don't we deal with that there on that particular panel. I'm going to just jump a little bit down because this may be helpful in terms of, because we are going to run out of time for all the questions. There's one here about how can I engage with resources and literature on this topic? I want to engage with the issues, but I don't really know where to start. Are there any particular books that you would recommend that you suggest people buy?
Absolutely. The best place to start, I think, is with engaging with the argument for genetic enhancement in its strongest term. And I refer to Nick Bostrom there, who is the guy right at the heart of all the kind of philosophical defense of the position. He has a website on which everything he's ever written is available to view. He's got a really entertaining and thought-provoking piece called A Letter from Utopia, where he takes the position of one of these future enhanced humanoids and writes back to all of us to entice us to try and get ourselves to where he is. It's a very interesting piece that maybe it might be fun for you to read. I really like a book by another chap called Michael Burdett. It's called Eschatology in the Technological Era. Now that sounds very scary. It simply means how to think about our lives and the afterlife in view of all of this technological development. So Eschatology in the Technological Era by Michael Burdett. And perhaps finally, a great book called Playing God by the theologian Ted Peters. Another really interesting analysis of some of the arguments at play, particularly from a Christian perspective. Those would be 3 recommendations.
Okay, and now let me throw in one other book too, because you may have it on your bookshelf if you ever bought stuff like this. But a long time ago, you may remember the novel Jurassic Park that came out, which was then made into a film. Well, if you buy the book and you go to the end of that book, you'll find a 15-page annotated bibliography of all of the literature at that time on the whole thing about gene editing, where the technology could take us, with a really, really interesting and quite long some of it going back for 30, 40, 50 years, about what various people were speculating and thinking about. So if you want to put it in this historical context, there you go. You're not the kind of book you're expecting to have recommended at an apologetics conference. But interesting nonetheless to see the kind of research he did when trying to think about the kind of genetic world that he was dreaming about there. So you can have a look at that. Let me then just take the next question. It says, it's easy to tackle CRISPR on the grounds of when it destroys human life, but what happens if we're simply talking about improving it, or making it better? How does that change our engagement with it?
Yeah, sure. So there are 2 really big categories of different types of genetic enhancement. The first would be what's referred to as somatic genetic enhancement, which is where we just do one thing to one person's body through the genes in a particular person, that part of their DNA for the treatment of one particular thing in them. And CRISPR can be used to do that, and it brings a cure for whatever the problem is on a kind of one-off occasion. The other type is the one that I was referring to more so, which was germline intervention, which is where we would remove these things from our children and from their ability to reproduce after that. Now, it does, unfortunately, all of the promises of this wonderful land of utopia and all of the great things that we think enhancement may entail, it does, unfortunately, in the case of germline intervention, have quite a lot of blood on the road before we get there. Julian Savulescu, who I mentioned, has this principle of procreative beneficence, which is this moral obligation I mentioned on parents to take a very careful look at the embryos they might implant, and if they're trying to have children via IVF, get rid of all of the suboptimal ones, and taking a particular view of the status of an embryo would bring lots of reasons to find that deeply problematic, and indeed if we were to analyze the DNA of a child in the womb. So germline intervention, unfortunately, this is how it's achieved, by editing the different gametes that would form an embryo, and taking a view of the quality that embryo's life would be expected to have. You kind of get into very difficult territory when you're assessing what the difference between treatment and enhancement is as well. We need to take a view of what is a life worth living? What is the line below which we need to try and improve things to make people have a life that we think is worth living? And above that line, we're starting to make ourselves better than well. I think that's a deeply problematic conversation associated with all of this as well. I don't want to be the person that says this is the line above which your life is worth living and the line below which it's not. That's another deeply problematic aspect with this thing.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. And let's thank Andy for sharing with us. We appreciate it. Well, I'm going to very quickly now introduce Dr. Callum Miller, who I've already set up with one very difficult question on the panel, for which I'm sure he's about to thank me. He is a research fellow at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. He has a real heart and passion for some of the very difficult moral issues, especially around life and death issues, to which he gives an inordinate amount of thought, and is a wonderful person to have around, partly to educate those of us who need ongoing education, as well as being able to communicate it at a more popular level. Calum, we're so glad you could join us here today. We're really great to have you on board. Sadly, you'll notice there's this very sad tendency amongst some of our younger team to start growing beards. This is a problem that we're coming to tackle. I always thought one of Margaret Thatcher's greatest insights into culture was she would never appoint anyone to the cabinet with a beard, feeling they always had something to hide, and there could be something in that. But even though he has a beard, we do trust him. Let's welcome up Calum as he comes to take the next issue for us.
Okay, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back in England. I was lucky enough to be in Australia for the last couple of weeks and got back Thursday night. The good news is that while I was over there, I had a great time. I met with a number of people working in advocacy and politics on life kind of issues, and we made a lot of kind of productive conversation. I learned a lot. I had a wonderful time out there. The bad news is that this is me with a tan, which is extremely distressing to say the least. I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot already today from the talks, in particular Sharon's talk. As a medical doctor myself, I was flattered and surprised to learn that we have emotional intelligence. We also learned that mushrooms have the same consistency as brains. Now, as someone who is a pretty fussy eater and who's worked in neuroscience in medical school, that actually taught me more about mushrooms than it did about brains. But nevertheless, a very informative and useful set of talks so far. The lesson here is that doctors are quite a morbid bunch, and I'm going to be talking about something reasonably morbid today. We're talking about ending life. We're talking about killing. And clarity about this is actually important because often these debates are debates where we don't have clarity, where we don't talk about the real truth of what's going on. And so I want to begin by defining terms and defining exactly what we're talking about. So my talk today is on euthanasia, which is a similar term to assisted suicide, but they are slightly different. What euthanasia means is a doctor or sometimes a non-medical professional killing a patient for some grounds, whether because the patient wants to be killed or because they are in extreme agony or on some other generally compassionate grounds. Assisted suicide is similar, but it involves the healthcare professional setting up the equipment and getting everything in place so that the patient themselves can press the button or take the pill to kill themselves. Fundamentally, this is about ending life, and it's about killing. And one of the reasons this is important is because often the debate in Parliament and in the media and in politics and so on has changed to a debate from euthanasia or assisted suicide to actually speak about assisted dying. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that we already have assisted dying. It's called palliative care. Assisted dying is helping someone to die in a dignified way, someone who is already dying, giving them the resources and comfort and support they need to ensure that they do so in as pain-free a way as possible and in as dignified a way as possible. Assisted dying is something we already have. But what people are wanting to introduce is assisted suicide in particular, or euthanasia in some cases. And this is quite different. This is the deliberate ending of someone's life by killing them or by helping them to commit suicide. And so, of course, assisted dying is quite offensive to people who already work in the area of palliative care, who already help people to die, unfortunately, in the most pain-free and as dignified way as possible. So thinking about the world more generally, euthanasia and or assisted suicide, it depends on the country, but one or two of these are legal in a few places around the world at the moment. So places like Canada, parts of the United States, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Victoria, Australia has just legalized it and will be implementing that soon. But it's only in a few countries at present, and most countries, and in fact many international organizations, have condemned the introduction of euthanasia into these countries. But it's actually something that we're not far off from in the UK. You might have been keeping up with this debate in the last few years, in which case you'll know that there have been bills periodically every few years trying to introduce euthanasia or assisted suicide to the UK. It's frequently debated all over Europe, frequently in the UK, and in many places they have quite strong laws being proposed. So in Spain, for example, the proposed law explicitly excluded conscientious objection for doctors, saying that if it were legalized, doctors would have to take part in this. And recently, I don't know if you'd heard, but the Royal College of Physicians was asked to have a vote on this. And so they voted, do they think assisted dying should be legalized in the UK? And the results were fairly well publicized around the UK. And the results actually were fairly even. So doctors have a fairly even view of it. Just about the majority who have made their mind up support keeping the law. So they think we should keep the law so that we don't have assisted dying. But a strong minority, 40% of doctors, think that we should have assisted dying in the country. Now, what's interesting about this, firstly, is that it's much less. It's a much smaller proportion than the general population. So if you look at opinion polling in the general population, most people support introducing assisted suicide in the UK. Doctors are significantly more hesitant about it. A second interesting thing about this, though, is that if you ask doctors to essentially put their money where their mouth is and ask them, would you be willing to do this yourself, the numbers change quite drastically. So yes, 40% of doctors think that assisted dying should be legal. But if you look at the number who are willing to actually do it, the number drops quite significantly to only 24%. Only 1 in 4 doctors would actually feel comfortable doing it themselves. And there's good evidence, actually, if you look at the psychological literature, and if you look at the literature about where countries have introduced euthanasia or assisted dying, doctors are, in fact, extremely uneasy about doing it. There's something psychologically and intuitively kind of repelling about engaging this from healthcare professionals. And it causes a lot of them many distress. Well, I said that doctors in general are more hesitant about assisted dying than the population at large. But another interesting thing is that this trend is seen even more strongly if we look at particular specialties within medicine, and in particular, palliative care. Palliative care doctors are the people who know most about this area. They're the people whose job it is to deal with people who are dying and to help them to die in a dignified and comfortable way. And people who understand the vulnerability of people who are dying, people who understand the challenges and difficulties that they face, are by far the most opposed group in the UK to assisted suicide. So if you look at the number of palliative care doctors who support a change in the law to permit assisted dying, it's only 9%. That's a small minority. So those doctors who know these patients best and who understand the challenges involved are by far the people most opposed to changing the law in the UK. It's worth understanding where we are in history to see where these kind of challenges come from, where did these laws come from, where is this kind of worldview coming from that thinks that assisted suicide would be something that we should have. Euthanasia actually in the classical world and in many parts of the country many parts of the world outside the West, find that euthanasia is okay. Many places around the world think that euthanasia is fine, and in particular in history, euthanasia, or helping someone to die in a dignified way by ending their life early, was actually reasonably common. But often Christians are seen as kind of backwards or seen as living in the Dark Ages because of their moral views about certain things. We're told that Christians are living in the Dark Ages. And the thing is about this, if we're criticizing a view because of its age, we should actually look at the alternative view. Because actually the alternative view that euthanasia is something that helps society, or that assisted suicide is something that helps society, is an even older view. And many of the views that Christians are seen as backwards for are actually improvements on much older views which had much less respect for human rights. So Christianity often improves the world with its moral views, and certainly has done so historically, because the world that Christianity came into was a world that was radically unequal and thought this was a good thing. It was a violent world, a sexist world, a racist world, an ableist world, classist, and so on. Christianity actually made an enormous change to this. One of the things in particular we see about the ancient world, particularly the Greco-Roman world, but also in some countries outside of kind of the Christian kind of world today, is that infanticide was relatively common. And infanticide was especially common for people who were deemed less useful to society. In particular, infanticide was seen as a good thing for female babies and for disabled babies, because it was thought that these people couldn't contribute to society. And we'll see why this is important to the debate about euthanasia throughout the presentation. As I say, with Christianity came a radical new era, a radical new concern for human equality, human dignity, and the sanctity of human life. And this concern has actually underpinned moral progress throughout the past couple of millennia. And in the 20th century, it specifically underpinned the idea of human rights and human equality. Well, after Christianity, when Christianity began to go out of fashion somewhat, towards the end of the 19th century, there was another ideology that helped contribute to this, and it was a scientific idea, the idea of Darwinism, that the strongest survive, that there's natural selection where the strongest people who are most able to survive end up surviving and reproducing more to pass on their genes. And this is reasonably well accepted within the scientific mainstream. But along with this went a social ideology, which said that in a way this was a good thing. And so there was this whole idea that it's good that the strongest survive and that the weakest don't survive. And many writers in the 19th century, outside of Germany, outside of places where fascist ideology was common, most writers, even in England, many writers, thought that this was a good thing, that we were weeding out the weak and that the stronger were being able to reproduce. And gradually we would have a race that was the strongest race or the strongest species that we could make it. So social Darwinism was on the rise. Utilitarianism, just this idea that we should essentially be productive, that we should not have any absolute moral values, but all we should do is just maximize the happiness in the world. These kind of ideologies were on the rise. And for these ideologies, euthanasia became an attractive option, because it's an easy way to get rid of some of the weak people in society. It's an easy way to get rid of a lot of the pain in society. And you can see why people who have a focus on this economic idea of growth and of the strongest people staying around, and people who had an idea that we should try our best to make the species the strongest it could be, thought that euthanasia was a good thing. And so early proponents of euthanasia in the UK recommended that we should have euthanasia for people that they called idiots and those who wasted resources. So Charles Goddard, who was one of the people kind of in charge of this movement, he said that we should have involuntary euthanasia, euthanasia without people asking for it, for idiots, beings having only semblance to human form, unable to enjoy life, and incapable of serving any useful purpose in nature. And of course, this ideology tragically came to a head under Nazism in the mid-20th century. And under Nazism, they particularly argued for euthanasia for useless people, people who didn't contribute much economically. And sometimes these would be disabled people, sometimes they would be newborns. So the Nazis had an enormous euthanasia program for children and newborns. And actually, in some places, children up to the age of 3 had to be reported by the midwives if they were disabled so that they could be euthanized. Now, shortly after the Second World War, there was a comment on this. It was a comment by Leo Alexander, who was a formidable physician, writing in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the top medicine journals in the world to this day. And he said, this is how it happened. And he was commenting on kind of the Nuremberg trials in the aftermath of World War II. It started with the acceptance by doctors of the idea, basic in the euthanasia movement, that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. This attitude in the beginning referred to the severely and the chronically ill. Gradually, the sphere of those to be included was enlarged to encompass the socially unproductive, the ideologically unwarranted, the racially unwarranted. But it's important to realize that the infinitely small lever from which this entire trend of mind received its impetus, the infinitely small lever that started all of this, was its attitude towards the incurably sick. That people who had a life not worthy to be lived should be killed and had their lives ended early. Now, one of the things we see if we look at the history of this, and if we look at the history of euthanasia and the history of Christianity, and the contribution that Christianity has made to our feelings about life and the value of life, and about the value of disabled people, and about the value of socially unproductive people, or economically unproductive people, we can see when we look at this history that actually we are potentially on the edge of something catastrophic. When you see the economic arguments for euthanasia, and when you see that throughout history, without Christianity essentially, societies have been willing to euthanize the socially and economically unproductive, we see that we are on the edge potentially of something which could lead to the loss of many, many lives, even in the West, and many, many lives which don't need to be lost and which shouldn't be lost. There are some writers in the 20th century who I'll get to in a moment, but if you think about euthanasia from an economic perspective, in a way it makes great sense, because we have an increasing lifespan in the West. People are living longer. And with an increasing lifespan, you have very extreme health consequences many times. If you look at the amount of money that's spent on people's lives in the last 6 months of their life, that's about 50% of the health cost for their entire life. At the end of people's lives, there are extreme economic costs. And because we're living longer, these costs are getting greater. There are other economic arguments for euthanasia, such as the fact that if we euthanize people, we can use their organs. And this sounds very dystopian, and it sounds like a straw man. It sounds like something that's completely crazy and scaremongering, but actually this has started in Belgium. In Belgium, they have begun using euthanized people for their organs. And you can see that with a changing demographic and with these economic arguments, there's a very powerful case to be made for euthanasia, such that we only have an infinitely small lever, in a sense, holding it back. And it's important to hold on to that barrier holding euthanasia back. So I'll just go back a moment. There are some people, actually very influential people, who put this fairly forthrightly. So Baroness Mary Warnock, I don't know if many of you have heard of her, she was one of the foremost ethicists of the 20th century, not just in academic ethics, but she was at the front of politics, at the front of policy, very powerful and influential in the English government, and she had a huge contribution to much policy about life issues in the UK at the end of the 20th century. And so this is not kind of a kind of maverick, radical fringe kind of ideology or proponent of it. But what she says about euthanasia was this, that if you're demented, if you have dementia, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the NHS. If somebody absolutely desperately wants to die because they're a burden to their family or the state, then I think they should be allowed to die. There's nothing wrong with feeling that you ought to die for the sake of others as well as yourself, simply because you are a burden to them, is what she's getting at. Jacques Attali, who was a very influential social theorist and economist and speaker in France in the 80s, he was an assistant and aide to the president of France in the 80s. He says that as soon as man or woman goes beyond 60 to 65 years of age, man lives beyond his capacity to produce, and he costs society a lot of money. Euthanasia will be one of the essential instruments of our future societies. And so many theorists, prominent theorists in the late 20th century, have said that euthanasia is something almost inevitable. And it's something that if people are a burden on society, euthanasia absolutely makes sense. But we can see that this ideology actually puts immense pressure on vulnerable people. For one thing, if we kill people in pain, and if we take the kind of convenient, easy way out in a sense, it will immensely reduce the incentive to develop palliative care. Because one of the main impetuses for palliative care in the 20th century was that life is worth living, and that we should, instead of just taking the easy way out, we should make life better for those people who are in desperate circumstances. If there is an easy way out, the incentive for that is drastically reduced. But also we see that where euthanasia or assisted suicide have been legalized, there's been an increase in suicides generally. It's something that puts pressure on vulnerable people to say, actually, if you feel like your life might not be worth living, I'm not necessarily going to convince you otherwise. Maybe what you should do is, in fact, end it. It does put these pressure on these people. So there's a paper in the Southern Medical Journal by an economist and a bioethicist that found in America where euthanasia and assisted suicide have been legalized, there's been a 6 to 12% increase in suicides generally, and particularly women and older people have been affected by this. These are vulnerable groups in society who are particularly influenced and encouraged to commit suicide because of these laws, because the option is there. And if we look at Oregon, one of the states in the US which has legalized assisted suicide, we see that 40 to 60% of requests for assisted suicide cite the fact that they are a burden on their families as a reason. And one of the most kind of concerning things about this is that this trend is increasing. So you probably can't see it very well from the table that I'm going to put up. But if you look at the last 20 years since euthanasia or since assisted suicide has been legalized in Oregon, the number of people who have cited the fact that they are a burden to their family and friends or caregivers has gone up from 34% in 1998 to 54% in 2018. This is a rapidly increasing trend that people in Oregon are feeling that they have to kill themselves because they are a burden to their families and friends. One of the other things we see in euthanasia and in assisted suicide and in the debates is that there's a slippery slope. Now, you might often have heard of a slippery slope as a fallacy. Sometimes it is a fallacy, but sometimes it is a genuine concern that if we introduce something in a small measure, it will inevitably deepen and it will inevitably become more severe and it will inevitably be something that becomes a part of society that we don't want to see. And that's very much what we've seen with euthanasia and assisted suicide. So initially, the idea of assisted suicide and euthanasia are to keep it very limited to terminal illnesses, to adults, to people who have capacity to make the decision, to keep it a voluntary decision, and to keep it just as assisted suicide rather than euthanasia. In fact, what we see and what we will inevitably see is that it becomes something quite different, that it will be used for chronic illnesses, sometimes for people who aren't ill at all. It will be used for children. It will be used for people who lack capacity, who can't make the decision for themselves and who have the decision made for them. And it will change to euthanasia, where the doctor has to do it themselves. Now, there are many reasons for thinking that this slippery slope is a reality. The first and best reason is that when we look at countries that have legalized it, we see this slippery slope, that it has gone to these lengths. A second argument for thinking that there is this slippery slope is that this is what happens with life issues in general. So if you look at the abortion debate from the 1960s, we initially saw that it would be used for very severe and extreme circumstances, and the people who introduced the bill thought there would be about 14,000 abortions a year at maximum, that it would be only used when there was a severe health risk. In fact, what we've seen in the UK, and what we see in the UK now, is that there are 200,000 abortions a year, and you can have an abortion up to 24 weeks, 2 weeks after viability, for any reason at all. And we even think there's probably some cases of sex-selective abortion in there. So this is something that we've seen, that when a policy is introduced, there is actually a huge difficulty in regulating it and keeping its initial intentions. The third reason for the slippery slope is the economic arguments I gave earlier. The fourth reason is the logical arguments, that actually if assisted suicide or euthanasia are fundamentally about autonomy, then it makes no sense to restrict it to these very extreme conditions. If someone thinks that autonomy is paramount and someone should be able to end their life themselves, it makes no sense to put restrictions on that. They should be able to end their life in whatever circumstances they find themselves in, for whatever reason, and with whatever method they choose. And so what we see is that the logical arguments for euthanasia, that autonomy is paramount, actually end up taking you down that slippery slope. And finally, a fifth reason is that campaigners have explicitly said this is what they want. They want euthanasia to be extended into these more controversial areas. But I just want to highlight one of the real case studies. This is Holland, where euthanasia has been legal for quite some time now. It was officially legalized in 2002. In 1991, before it was officially legalized, it still went on, and they found that about 2% of deaths in Holland were euthanasia or assisted suicide. And actually, 1% of these, or nearly 1%, were without a request for assisted suicide, so they were involuntary. Now, of course, things have got much more extreme. There are 6,000 cases a year in Holland, and this is 4% of all deaths. And a further 12 to 15% of deaths in Holland are from terminal sedation, which is when a patient is essentially put to sleep and then starved to death. This is the reality that we've seen in Holland, even though they initially said there would be a huge number of safeguards there. In Holland also, we've seen huge political pressure for people to be able to be euthanized or commit assisted suicide simply because they're tired of life. People who are not ill in any way, people who are perfectly healthy, but they're tired of life. And 20% of Dutch doctors have said that they would do so. We've seen in Holland that about 15 to 20 newborn babies are killed a year simply because they have disabilities which they think the baby would not want to live with. And we've seen a rapid increase in psychiatric patients, people with depression or anorexia, and people with dementia who have undergone euthanasia and assisted suicide in the last few years. So what can a Christian response say to all of this? There's much more that could be said, and I've tried to fit in as much as I could in such a short time. The main problems that we see are a lack of autonomy, a lack of dignity. These are the two main reasons people cite for wanting to have euthanasia or assisted suicide. We see feelings of uselessness and worthlessness, and the idea that it's good that someone doesn't exist, or that it's not good that you do exist. Well, Christianity says something quite different, quite radically different. It says that we are radically dependent, but this isn't a bad thing. So most people think they want to commit suicide or have euthanasia because they have lost their dependence. Christianity says humans were made to be dependent. We were made to share each other's burdens, and there's nothing undignifying about that. In fact, instead, we have dignity not because we are independent, but because we're made in God's image, and we share his image. Christianity says that it doesn't matter if you can't contribute much to society, if you feel useless. Our value is not dependent on what we can contribute to society or what we can achieve. It's dependent on the fact that we're made in God's image and that each human is made with that image of God that makes them valuable and gives them that overwhelming infinite dignity on which our human rights are based. And finally, Christianity says it's good that you exist. Even if you are going through an extremely difficult time, it's good that you exist. You bear God's image, and you are valuable and worthy. And so the Christian response, as I said, there's much more that could be said and that needs to be said, but the Christian response for all of us is to embody these ideas, these values. It's to change the culture so that dependence is no longer seen as undignifying or useless or a burden, but actually so that the dependence is seen as a normal part of human existence. We need to change the culture so that human dignity is seen apart from what we can contribute to society, but it's seen because we are bearers of God's image. And that dignity remains regardless of our circumstances or regardless of our usefulness. And in fact, it's these values which have allowed us to make great strides in palliative care in the last few decades. We've made enormous advances in palliative care in the last few decades, and there's every reason to think that that will continue if we really focus on that and don't take what can be seen as the convenient way out. And so just finishing with what Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, our fundamental duty here is to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so I hope I've given you at least some tools to think about how we can do that. And I'd love to hear any more thoughts you have about how we can do that together. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Callum. When he got up to speak, we were talking earlier, and he said, I could easily do this session over an hour, the amount of material I have, and so you got a taster there. And so just as we go and maybe just take one or two questions now, I'll begin out by pointing that during the break, Andy will be over on this little round table over here to your left, and Callum over at this little round table here to your right. So if you have questions for either of them, then please do go to them and ask them their questions there. And we'll have other people in pink lanyards there counting the number of people lining up to ask each one of them questions, and whoever has the biggest line gets the largest end-of-year bonus. It's part of a new performance review thing that we're introducing, which Callum may feel very strongly about. Callum, so let me just ask the one question here. It says, would it be more cruel in the eyes of God to prolong the suffering of an individual who is of sound mind than to keep them and allow them to end their life at a time and manner of their choice? Do you see that? Would it be more cruel? Is it more cruel to prolong someone's life or just allow them? Is it not less cruel, therefore, to let them end it?
This is a really good question, and it's somewhat difficult to answer because our natural instinct is to think, surely it's cruel to allow people to suffer. One of the things Jesus said that he would do is to wipe away every tear and to heal our suffering. And that obviously gives Christians a good reason to think that God doesn't want our suffering. In Revelation, it says God will wipe away every tear from our eye. Suffering is not something that God wants. Suffering is an intrusion into the world. And this sets Christianity radically apart from certain other worldviews which say suffering is God's will, or suffering is deserved, or suffering is illusory. Christianity says suffering is real and it's something that God wants to get rid of and that he will get rid of. The difficulty, of course, with euthanasia is that Christians seem to be saying we want people to suffer. We want people to remain alive in their suffering. Now, of course, most of us know that that's not what Christians want. It's certainly not what I want. It's certainly not what most doctors want. But the question is suffering a reason in favor of ending someone's life? And is it something that powers or overrides the dignity that their life has and that the value their life has just because they exist? And I think what can be helpful to kind of think about this question is to think about what we would say to someone who is suffering temporarily, and we think their suffering is going to get better. When we look at these people's lives, say someone wants to commit suicide, and working in psychiatry for a few months, I had many, many patients who wanted to commit suicide. There was no question in the culture of psychiatry when I worked there that it would be good to end their life because we would end their suffering. What we thought instead was we will try our very best to improve their life, to make them happy again, to give them things worth living for. And sometimes the difficulty with euthanasia is that we can't see that kind of better time. We can't necessarily picture easing their suffering. But the fundamental principle of Christianity and the fundamental principle for doctors here is that actually people have worth regardless of their suffering, and that suffering should be eliminated, but not by killing the person. When we work in psychiatry, we think we're not just going to kill someone because they're suffering a lot. We want to do our very, very best to help them. And so even though by helping them and by stopping them committing suicide, we are exposing them to suffering, that's not because we want the suffering, and it's not because we're cruel, but it's because we see the dignity of their life and we see a better time for them when they can look back on their suffering and hopefully find some meaning in it. And so what I would say there is that God allows suffering, and there's no question that God allows suffering in the world more generally, and that is a talk that could take another half hour or an hour to speak about. God certainly allows suffering, but he allows it because he sees the dignity in us, and he says, I value you, and you have dignity even when you're suffering, and even when you feel you can't contribute much. And that's better than simply ending your life and giving up on you. And the second thing God says is, I've given you hope that there is a time when I will wipe away every tear. And when you look back at your suffering from that time, it will make sense. And the fundamental picture in the Christian story of this is Jesus' crucifixion. At the time, it seems like God is being cruel. It seems like Jesus' suffering makes no sense. And yet when Jesus looks back on his suffering and he sees the whole story, and when we see the whole story from the end of the story, we see that that extreme moment of suffering was one of the most profound, important, central events in human history, and it's what won salvation for us. And so our hope is that by trusting in Jesus and following him, when we have suffering, we can have assurance that God doesn't want it, that he will get rid of it. But secondly, that when we look back on our suffering from the end, he will have found some way to make it meaningful. And so we can trust in that hope. And that's why I think we can allow suffering in certain contexts, doing our very best to get rid of it, trusting God that he will make it meaningful in the end. I hope that makes some sense.
Let's just thank Callum again for sharing with us.
Thank you for taking the time to watch as my colleagues Andy Moore and Dr. Callum Miller guided us through two of the most significant questions within the medical world of the present and the future. As Christians living in the 21st century, confronting the advancement of genetic engineering and the increasing prevalence of euthanasia is going to be nearly impossible to avoid in our public and our personal lives. If watching these talks has encouraged you to think more about apologetics, why not have a look at the RZIM Academy? This online academy is designed to help Christians to grow in their thinking and reasoning, and also in their ability to defend the faith. So take a look at rzim.org/training.
The RZIM Academy was born out of Ravi's vision for creating an online training program. At the time, we were offering great in-person training in places like the OCCA in Oxford, England, or summer programs in specific cities in the US, Canada, and India. But what about those who can't get to those places? Then we started the Academy. I'm not sure we realized how much interest there would be, but we're celebrating 5 years since we launched our first course, and the response has been overwhelming.
From the first lecture in the core module, I was all in because I knew it was exactly what I needed to strengthen my personal relationship with Christ, to ground me in my faith so that I was able to not only demonstrate what it means to be a Christian, but also defend it.
Just the wealth of the information presented and the way in which it was conducted, the heart behind the program really made an impact in my life.
Was ich persönlich besonders gut an der Zacharias Akademie finde, ist, dass sie mich dafür sensibilisiert, meinen Gesprächspartner ernst zu nehmen und ihn wertzuschätzen. Es geht in Gesprächen ja nicht nur darum, auf Fragen zu antworten, sondern einer Person zu begegnen, die hinter der Frage steht.
At first I thought this is an academic challenge for me, but to my surprise, it was something that really changed and transformed the way I view evangelism, the way I view Christianity.
We've now enrolled more than 10,000 students from more than 130 different countries. We have courses in 4 languages. We have a growing list of elective courses on topics like Islam, suffering, the Bible, science, what it means to be human, with more being produced each year.
I think a lot of people will find it helpful. A lot of people will find it that it may push them to reach out to others. You'll probably reach people you never imagined you can reach before or even talk to. And I feel it's the skills and that confidence that we know not only what to say and how to say it and how to relate to others with the gospel.
The feedback and stories we hear from students has been tremendous, and we're really encouraged to continue to build this program and watching how God uses it all over the globe.
This is the task of Christian apologetics, whether it be in debate, whether it be in argument, whether it be in defense, whether it be in confirmation. It is ultimately to present the person of Jesus Christ and who he is. Set apart that Christ in your heart, and always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you, and do that with gentleness and respect.